everybody. Thank you for abbreviating your school meeting time and being here with us this morning. Bill Ferris, class of 1960, Brooks graduate, is here with us. I'm thrilled that he's here for so many reasons about what we're doing at Brooks right now in the arts. And I hope you all will get a chance to go to the Lehman and see Mr. Ferris' work. And he is, I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up. He is the Joel Williamson Eminent Professor of History and the Senior Associate Director of Center for the Study of the American South and the Adjunct Professor in the Curriculum in Folklore at UNC Chapel Hill. So he is all hoping, if you all are thinking at all about UNC Chapel Hill, that you will think about it with a little bit more focus and go and find him if you get down to UNC Chapel Hill. We are thrilled to have him here. He is here all weekend celebrating his 55th reunion. And so without anything else to say, except if your phones are on, please at least make them silent. And we know there are a few of you that need to head out a few minutes early to get to your next class, so just do so out of the back so you're not too distracted. Mr. Ferris, thank you.
Thank you, Gage. It's really wonderful to be back. I teach. I grew up on a farm in Mississippi, and my brother and two cousins all came to Brooks in the late 50s and early 60s. And it changed our lives as your lives are being changed. For me, it was moving out of the deep South and coming into New England and having a Southern accent that my classmates couldn't understand. So when I asked about funny papers, they had no idea I was talking about comics. My friend Robert Penn Warren once told me that a fish never thinks about water until he's out of it. So you never think about who you are until you leave your worlds that you grow up in. And I ended up as a folklorist. It was a journey I began here, going back south in my mind, and trying to understand what it really meant to be a Southerner and an American and a person in the 20th and now 21st century of the globe, because they're all connected. So I teach folklore. My parents and friends thought I would never hold down a job, going around and interviewing blues singers and storytellers. But I did, and I tell my students, as I'll tell you, follow your heart, and you will be happy and successful. Do what your heart tells you, not what your parents or teachers. You follow that inner drumbeat. So I studied folklore, and that has been my sort of mantra, is to study what are, in effect, oral traditions, the stories, the music, things that are passed on orally. Every group has folklore. As Brooks students, you are a group. You talk about yourselves internally, and people who are not part of this group talk about you. There's also the folklore of race, of gender, of occupation. It's a rich, wonderful field. And when I teach my classes, I teach a class each fall on Southern music and each spring on Southern literature, the oral tradition. And I tell my students an African proverb that says, when an old woman or man dies, a library burns to the ground. Think about it for a moment. How many of you have done an interview with your grandparents? Let's see a show of hands. Recorded it. That's great. Well, I hope within the next year or so, all the hands will go up, because that is a moment that you can pass to your grandchildren as a powerful capsule of memory and time. I'm going to talk with you today, and I know some of you have been studying Mark Twain, who is the first great American novelist who wrote arguably the greatest American novel, Huckleberry Finn. And he essentially embraced the American language, the vernacular language and speech of black and white America, and broke from the old world European traditions. And I argue that America is many threads, and the South, that are drawn together, both the classic canon of literature and music and art, and the vernacular folk voices. And your new art center hopefully will embrace both the classic museum artists and the folk artists. Your music department will embrace both your canon of composers and the folk vernacular voices, like that of the greatest of all blues singers, B.B. King, who died yesterday. And we will dedicate this class to B.B. I'm going to talk with you about my latest book, which is called The Storied South. When I do a book, usually the title comes from inside the book, and there's a quote that sort of jumps off the page. In this case, I didn't see that, and I talked to my wife. I said, I can't find a title. She said, well, what's a book really about? And I said, well, the key is that all of these people love to hear stories, and they're great storytellers. And she said, well, why don't you call it The Storied South? So that's what I called it. These are people over the years, over the last 40 years, that shaped my career as a student of the South. These are the people who laid the foundations as writers, as scholars, as artists, as musicians. And I had the good luck to meet them. And I am hardwired to record and photograph and film people. So when I meet these people along the way, I said, would you mind if I recorded you or filmed you? And they always said, well, of course. Well, many years later, I pulled all those threads together. So I'm going to walk you through this, and I'm moving quickly because we have a limited amount of time. And I want to leave time at the end, so if you have questions, we can sort of respond to those. So if I can get the lights down, and this is a great room for this. We're going to start where it started in rural Mississippi. And I didn't know what I was doing, and I venture to say you don't know where you're going with your life, but you're getting a hell of an education at Brooks. There's nowhere better. And for me, part of my education was the world in which I was born. And I, with camera, and my brother taught me how to use a camera in a dark room. He had learned it here at Brooks. And I knew I needed to have that skill set. So thanks to Brooks and my brother Gray, I began to photograph the worlds that gave me a sense of direction. And I began to look outward for my own family as a white Mississippian, and to understand the black worlds that are so very important on the farm where I grew up and throughout the whole South. And I began to look along the roadsides at the everyday life, what the French call la vie quotidienne, those moments that are everyday moments that we take for granted that shape us in such powerful, lasting ways. And stories, I would argue, are the key. If I want to know who you are, I will ask you your favorite story. And embedded within it is your deepest love and fear and passion. The stories I first discovered were on the front of little grocery stores near my home, Aiden White's country store at the Crossroads, and on the farm a small grocery store run by Virginia Peel Davis. Any day of the year, at any hour, if you sat in those benches, you would hear stories that would go on and on. Memorable, beautiful, powerful stories by people like Robert Appleton, whom I grew up with on the farm, who told me that his ancestors and all of the ancestors of black families there had walked up the Natchez Trace as slaves from Natchez, Mississippi to the farm and had settled there. Those were memories that reminded me of the power of the story. So I began to deal with stories, and one of my oldest and dearest friends was Eudora Welty, whose work I first read here at Brooks. And she became a dear friend. She would visit my classes when I taught at Yale in the 70s. She would come there. She came to our family's farm. And she, like many writers, was also passionate about photography. So we see the merging of literary and artistic worlds that are part of the American South. Here she is photographing on our family's farm her old dear friend Cleonth Brooks, who taught literature at Yale for many years and was a Faulkner specialist. And Cleonth and Eudora came to the University of Mississippi when I worked there for the dedication of the William Faulkner postage stamp. Eudora Welty read from her famous short story, Why I Live at the P.O. Cleonth lectured on Faulkner's brief stint as postmaster of the post office in Oxford, Mississippi. He lasted only a week. He was fired for throwing away mail. And when someone asked him what the problem was, he said, I refuse to be at the beck and call of every son of a bitch with 5 cents who wants to buy a stamp. So Eudora Welty and Cleonth Brooks were thrilled to focus that day on William Faulkner. I would visit her at her home in Jackson and spend time with her oldest and best friend, Charlotte Capers. She came to Yale and spoke to my classes, and we were able to get, for both Eudora and B.B. King, an honorary doctorate of humane letters at Yale, a very important moment for both. And each time I would come back home to visit family, I would call Eudora and say I was coming over and we would visit, and I would take her a bottle of Maker's Mark bourbon. And we would each pour and have a glass, and the stories would flow. And toward the end of her life, her hearing was not as good as it used to be, and I called and said, Eudora, I'd like to come over tomorrow and see you. Would that be all right? She said, oh, that would be lovely. What time are you coming? I said, 10:30. She said, did you say 7:30? I said, no, 10:30. She said, oh, good. For a moment there, I thought you were testing our friendship. So she had a lovely quality of humor, and she loved to talk about the craft of fiction and what it meant.
I keep forgetting how old I am, but I've got some students ask me, somebody said, Miss Wilson, do you always write stories about olden times? And I said, well, the stories you're talking about, I wrote, back in the 40s or something. That's because I was writing when those things were happening. I wasn't writing about mysterious, hidden past. It was the present when I was writing about it. And so it was real and belonged in the story. Now the present reflects other things. But that's what happens in the world and the time, and you got to reflect that too. I did do think that it's important to understand the reality, but not to obliterate what's gone before in the interest of saying that nothing is real but the present.
Alice Walker transformed our understanding of the black experience through the color purple and the power and struggles of black women. And she was a dear friend and still is, who I met when I first began teaching in 1970. And she talked with me about the role of the writer and the black writer in the South and the complexity of that relationship.
I think I'm dealing with regions inside people. You know, although they are the people who are in the South. And in fact, I guess I really just leave that up to other people to decide. I mean, if they can only understand writing by placing it in a context, that's fine. I don't really quarrel with it. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm really trying to understand people and how they get to be the way they are. So the region is the mind and the heart, not not the section.
Pete Seeger, while not born in the South, was transformed by the region. It was there that he discovered the banjo and the traditional black hymn that he rearranged into the anthem of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome." And he took that all over the globe, building on the civil rights movement in the South, and in Tiananmen Square, when students were demonstrating, "We Shall Overcome" was sung there. He took a Southern sound and the civil rights movement, of which he was a key part, and he made it a global movement and an anthem. And his father and mother were distinguished musical leaders. His mother, Ruth Crawford Seeger, was the first female composer in America. His father, Charles Seeger, founded the field of ethnomusicology. But Pete left those distinguished academic worlds and entered the world of folk tradition and music. And that is a sort of story that...
I'm quite proud that two phrases I invented are now used by banjo pickers, and I think some guitar pickers all over the country. As you come down with your left hand and hit a note, you don't need to touch it with your right, you got a note. It's usually you strike the same string first with your right hand. Wow, what a discovery. You get notes with your left hand as well as your right. And I invented that phrase, pulling off. My mother, violinist, said that's called left-hand pizzicato. Back with that, I call it pulling off.
William Christenberry, whose photography is in your collections here, grew up in rural Hale County, Alabama, where Walker Evans, another great American photographer whose work you also have, photographed and was the partner of James Agee, who wrote one of the great books on the American South and on photography, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And Christenberry went back with Walker. Walker was an elderly photographer, Bill Christenberry a young man, and they revisited those worlds and shared in a powerful way. Christenberry...
It was in the early 1960s that I began a body of work trying to express my abhorrence of the Ku Klux Klan. I had left Alabama in 1961 and went to New York for a year. And it was that period in New York that I began to think of ways to deal with not only the Klan as subject matter, but various other aspects of deep feeling about where I was from, and that is Alabama and the Deep South. I hold a position that it's an artist's responsibility to at least express himself, herself, in terms of these issues, not to avoid them, not to put them away in a closet, but to try to deal with them head on.
Rebecca Davenport is a painter, and she is a Southern artist in the deepest sense who shows how painters and the visual arts are in conversation with the literary tradition. And as an undergraduate art major at the University of North Carolina, she discovered the work of Flannery O'Connor, one of the edgiest Southern female writers ever. And she found in Flannery O'Connor's work the inspiration for her own painting and never looked back after that discovery.
The writers, there's such a tradition, and the painters that I know from the South, it's out of very much the same kind of thing, and it's again, it's the sense of strong sense of appreciating irony. This painting here is Emmanuel Episcopal Church, and these are people that I grew up with, and matter of fact, I'm in it, and the preacher, who is Brother Dave, he's the only Episcopal minister that has a tattoo on his right cheek, his rear end. I was very proud of that. He told everybody about that. When I was going to school in North Carolina, I was very fortunate to know a couple of people that were in the literature department. And they were very influential at a very formative time. And it was suggested by someone that I start reading Flannery O'Connor, which I had never read. And I started reading her short stories, and I was just, oh my God, this stuff's wonderful. This is really what I want to say, visually, as she said.
Another important painter from rural Georgia, Benny Adams, was the son of a sharecropper's family, and he began drawing in cotton fields where he was picking cotton. And he eventually became the head of the Visual Arts Division at the National Endowment for the Arts. And again, his vision of stories and of taking the visual arts from the oral tradition is very powerful.
We would work from sun up to sundown, and flat lands of cotton, just as far as you could see would be cotton. And it would be hot and things like that. And you'd be doing this repetitive thing. You'd be going from one end of a row to another that would be just unbelievably long. And you had to do something to keep your mind occupied. So I would look up at the clouds, and I got to a place where I could make pictures out of clouds. So I'd be working, picking cotton, holding cotton, whatever I'd be doing, and I'd just be making pictures up. And sometimes I'd just stop and draw in the sand and things like that. And at night when I go home, I would just draw some of those things I'd seen in the clouds. And even now I can look up and just make up whole illustrations across the sky. And that had to do again with that raw, austere thing of the survive.
So it all starts and ends with a story. Traveling around Jackson with Eudora Welty, someone saw these pictures and said she shouldn't have been driving and telling stories at the same time. Well, you don't tell Eudora Welty anything. You just sit there and listen as you listen to grandparents. So this is a kind of glimpse into a world that, to me, is a way of taking command of who we are as people and of understanding things that are very simple. And I understand we have 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop here.